It is good to be with you on this last day of Advent as we prepare to celebrate one of the most important events in salvation history, the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, I love Christmas. I love celebrating Christmas with you all. I love reading the Christmas story and imagining what it must have been like for various characters in that story when these events took place. You can think about it from the perspective of the shepherds who all of a sudden found a host of angels around them declaring that a Messiah would be born. Or if you look to the Gospel of Matthew and its version of the events, you could imagine what it was like to be the Magi who saw this strange sign in the sky and made the decision to trek for miles to pay homage to this newborn king. Or even from the perspective of King Herod, who was so threatened by the birth of a baby that he ordered that children in Bethlehem be killed. Any of those are worthy of our reflection. But this morning, I want to think about the most important character in this story after Jesus himself. And that's Mary, Jesus' mother. I want us to imagine what it would have been like to be her and consider how her faith and her example can be an example for us. Now, we've had opportunity just a few minutes ago already to think about Mary and her role in this story. Angie gave us a couple of snapshots of some of the most defining moments of Mary's life. There's this moment, of course, when an angel appears before her. I think that would be a defining moment for just about anyone, and gives her this overwhelming news that she would be the mother of the Messiah and that she would conceive as a virgin. And what's amazing is not just that that happened, but that Mary, already in that overwhelming moment, said to God, "Let it be," a response that changed the rest of her life. And then we jump 9 months later into the time when Jesus was actually born. And what a roller coaster of an experience that must have been for Mary. I imagine that she probably felt bad, knowing that she was carrying the King of Kings in her belly, that she had to give birth to him among animals, and couldn't even put him in a crib, but had to lay him down in a manger from which animals ate. And yet, at the same time, that very night, shepherds began showing up, praising God for his presence. The whole community began talking about what a wonderful thing had happened in Bethlehem. And so here she knew that even amidst her humble circumstances, God was with her. Well, I actually want to bring in a third snapshot from Mary's life before we go any further with this. I want to jump 30 years later, when we're at the time right as Jesus was beginning his public ministry, coming out as the Messiah. In fact, you could question whether he had really started it or not, because at this point, Jesus had already gathered a few disciples. Some people started following him, but he hadn't performed any of the miraculous signs that he became known for, which really built up his reputation as a possible follower of David. And so, I want to take a moment to read on this incident that occurs when Jesus, who still had a relatively low profile at this time, went with his disciples and his mother to a small local wedding in Cana. It says this: 3 days later, there was a wedding in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples were guests also. When they started running low on wine at the wedding banquet, Jesus' mother told him, "They're just about out of wine." Jesus said, "Is that any of our business, mother, yours or mine?" "This isn't my time, don't push me." She went ahead anyway, telling the servants, "Whatever he tells you, you do it." I pulled this from the Message because I think it kind of captures the folksy interaction between Jesus and his mom. Because what goes on to happen is that Jesus does ultimately do what his mom asks him to do and turns the water into wine. I've highlighted this as an example of humor in the Bible because I think it is very relatable. Even Jesus apparently had to do things from his mom that he didn't really want to do, right? This is a very human experience that he has. But at the same time, this story reveals some important things. It reveals what kind of a relationship Jesus and Mary had. Think about what isn't said in between the two of them. When Jesus is responding to his mother, he just makes the brief comment, "This isn't my time." Any onlooker would have wondered, time for what? What are you talking about? But Jesus knew that Mary knew exactly what he meant. Because Jesus and Mary had probably talked about his time dozens, maybe hundreds of times. After all, who else would have reflected with Jesus on who he was supposed to be? You know, Christians believe that Jesus is God, and that's an important part of our faith. But at the same time, we believe that he was a human being who had to develop physically, had to develop mentally, had to develop emotionally. And a part of that development meant that somebody along the way had to come along and teach him, give words to his experience, tell him who he was. Don't you imagine that it was probably Mary telling him the very words that the angel told her about what his identity and role would be? So Mary and Jesus clearly had this kind of shared understanding of who he was, one that he very likely got from her. And not only that, but she was also his greatest encourager and the one who had the most confidence in him. It's almost annoying how much confidence she says when, she just turns immediately to the servants and says, "Whatever he tells you, do it." You have to wonder if Jesus, because remember at this point, Jesus had not performed any public miracles. He hadn't done it. You have to wonder if Jesus was a bit hesitant, a bit nervous, if he had those human feelings. But his mom didn't doubt him. She had confidence. Her faith was the cornerstone of Jesus' development as the Messiah. And that tells us just how important faith really is. Faith is not just a garnish that we can put on life to add a little bit of flavor, which you may or may not put on there if you want. Faith is the very thing that gets us through life. It anchors us when life is unstable. It guides us when we're lost and we don't know what to do. It gives us hope in those moments that take our breath away and we find ourselves in despair. Faith is the reason that we gather on Christmas and every other time as a church family to remember and believe in what God has done so that we can continue to live that out in our lives. But what if we find that our faith is shaken? What if we find that people are starting to question things that we'd always been taught, and now all of a sudden we're not so sure what we believe on even some fundamental issues? Or what if we experience that our life, after it had been going well, after we thought we were doing what God wanted us to do, took an unexpected turn? And now we're not sure why we're here. What if we find ourselves disappointed or disillusioned with God? How are we supposed to participate in something like this? How are we supposed to just conjure up the faith of Mary? We might think that Mary's story really doesn't have much to say to us because Mary had a number of experiences that I would guess nobody in this room has had. I, for one, have never had an angel appear to me and speak to me. At times I think that would be nice. It would be lovely to have someone clearly say, this is what you're supposed to do, now go and do it. And then in addition to this angelic experience, Mary also had experienced the miracle of conceiving, even though she was a virgin. And she had her experience confirmed when shepherds showed up on the night that Jesus was born, testifying that they too had seen angels who spoke about the birth of the Messiah. And so Mary, it seems, had these powerful experiences behind her that surely made faith come easy to her. But I'm not so sure about that. Because there is no experience, no matter how potent or warm or meaningful, that can't be doubted given enough time and challenge. Yes, we know that Mary had this kind of series of experiences when she was a young woman, but then the gospel is largely silent, giving us the impression that for the next 3 decades she lived a pretty ordinary life. Not seeing angelic visitors reminding her and giving her tips along the way, not having magi from the east continuing to fund her whenever there was a need. She had to hold on to those experiences that she had had through many years of time. And there were challenges. There were things that came up that made her question whether what she had heard and seen was real. She was told that her son was going to be the Messiah of Israel, but all of a sudden she and her husband found themselves fleeing to Egypt. How could Jesus possibly be the leader of the Jewish people in Israel if he wasn't even in the country? They moved back to Nazareth, of course, but even then, questions would have arose. I mean, when Joseph starts teaching Jesus some of his skills in carpentry, I wonder if Mary was thinking, shouldn't he be studying the Bible instead? Or when Jesus actually did begin his ministry, but he refused to let people call him a king. And he taught people to turn the other cheek, rather to arm themselves to prepare to defend his kingdom. All of this would have made her question and rethink the things she'd heard. Perhaps one of the most important parts of keeping a memory alive is being able to communicate it with others. And you would think that Mary would have lots of people to do that with because the entire town of Bethlehem was talking about and celebrating the birth of Jesus when he came. But of course she had to flee Bethlehem. She likely lost track, lost communication with all of the shepherds and the neighbors and the people who were there on the night that her son was born. And when she and Joseph finally did come back to Israel, they had to keep a low profile, be secretive about who they were, lest they offend one of Herod's relatives. And then at some point along the way, it seems that Joseph, her husband, had died. Now, the Bible doesn't lay this out for us. It doesn't mention the details. But given how involved Joseph was at the events at the beginning of Jesus' life, and his complete absence from everything that happens to Jesus when he's an adult, Most biblical scholars come to the conclusion that Joseph must have died while Jesus and Mary were still young. Imagine what a loss that would be for her. Not only as a wife, not only becoming a single mother, but that she lost the only other person who had witnessed and experienced these events with her firsthand. And now she was the only one who really knew what God was doing with Jesus. That is a lot of weight put on the shoulders of one person. That is a hard faith to keep. So how did she do it? Well, we have this short comment, this verse near the end of the story that I think gives us some insight. Luke 2:19 says, "And Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart." Now, I'm not sure if I really appreciate the way that English translations use treasured to translate the Greek word here. Because treasured, at least to me, it gives me the impression that it's talking about kind of an emotional experience. Like, oh, she just wanted to soak all of these things up because it felt so good and she was so inspired by them. But that's not really what it means. I would argue that a more accurate translation of the word is preserved. She preserved all of these words. It's the same word used to describe the way that wineskins preserve wine over the course of time. It's an intentional act where she committed to memory the things that she was seeing and experiencing and continued to bring them up to the forefront of her attention, not only on that day, but in the days and weeks and years to come. I have found that the people I know who have the strongest faith, they have their most significant experiences with God always on the forefront of their mind. They can remember when God first convicted them or saved them or healed them like it was yesterday. And praises are always on the tips of their tongues. And I would bet that at some point along the way, God has come to you. God has showed up in your life. Maybe it is a vivid experience that you remember. Maybe it was a situation where you haven't even fully noticed or appreciated it yet. But I pray that you will let the Spirit work in your memory and your mind so that you can remember and preserve those times when God spoke to you. Now we may think, this sounds a bit unhealthy even, right? Like just hanging on to the past, clinging on to nostalgia, that's not healthy. You don't want to just close your ears and say, well, this is what I believe, and so I'm sticking with it no matter what. But that's not what Mary did. She did not model an uncritical faith. The passage says that Mary preserved all these words and pondered them in her heart. Mary was a ponderer. She liked to think about the things that she was experiencing. We see this word appear both in her experience with the angel Gabriel and her experience here in Luke chapter 2. And I think it's safe to say that Mary continued to ponder and think about what these things meant for the rest of her life. She would say, okay, how, now that we are in Egypt, can these words that the angel told me apply? What kind of Messiah is God calling my son to be? What is my role at this stage in life, now that he's a young child or a teenager or an adult? She pondered, she asked questions, but she kept coming back. And you know, that happens as we get older, our perspective changes, things challenge us and shake us. That's part of growing as a human being. But that does not nullify the experiences that we've had with God. I'm telling you, when God has spoken and shown up in your life, that is real. So preserve that. Ponder on that. Let that be the thing that fills your heart and mind. Because for some reason, God does not tend to continue to give us a constant stream of angelic visitors and miraculous signs. It's almost as though God wants us to go through these periods of time in which our faith is stretched as we wait to hear for God to respond. But if we remember what God has done for us before, we can know that the God who was with us then is still with us now. And if we listen, we may still be able to hear the echoes of God's words and God's presence in our hearts.